Um, so I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I think this is going to be a really interesting 90 minutes. So welcome to this first HousingX chat that we've had this year. These conversations, I think you may know, are an outgrowth of our HousingX Rethink the Box conference that we did here in 2019. We'd hoped to hold the second one of those this spring, but as you know, we're still in a virtual world. So here we are. But the good news is that we'll be hosting our second HousingX live conference in person next spring. I guarantee it'll be exciting and interactive, and we'll have 3D printing and a host of other housing innovations. So stay tuned for details on that, and we'll plan to all get together in person next spring for that event. So one of the few benefits of the pandemic, and there haven't been many, is that it's become commonplace for us to meet with people virtually that time and distance would have made impossible in a face-to-face world. We settled on this idea of talking to some of our international housing colleagues a few months ago, and honestly, I'm not sure that it would have occurred to us to do this, but for the shift to virtual communication that we've all embraced over the past year. We Americans can be pretty insular at times in our thinking and focus only on our own problems, our own solutions. This is true in our housing sector and many others as well. I have been doing this work in affordable housing for over 40 years, and I know a good deal about how we do affordable housing in other states outside of Virginia, but I know very little about the challenges and successes in other countries. We have a bunch of people on this webinar today, well over 150. That's a big number for our webinars. And so I think there's a lot of people who feel the same way that I do. So this morning, we're gonna pull back that curtain a bit and dramatically expand our horizon in terms of how we think about affordable housing. We have 4 presenters with diverse backgrounds who have worked in and analyzed affordable housing in very diverse geographies. Let me start by introducing all 4 of our presenters, and then each of them will do a presentation, and after that we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can put questions into the Q&A at any time. Encourage you to do that at any time, and the panelists will see those questions during the presentation. Some of them we may respond to online immediately, and some we may hold until we get to the Q&A session after the presentations are complete. So first, I want to introduce Helen Collins. Helen's been a director at Savills since 2012. She leads Savills Affordable Housing Consultancy and sits on the UK board. Helen's team provides a range of strategic and property consultancy advice to housing associations, local housing authorities, investors, and developers. Her career spans 30 years working in a senior advisory and delivery role. Helen specializes in public-private sector initiatives for growth, strategic partnerships, and asset optimization. Recent projects include Homes England's Strategic Partnership Initiative and delivery of a number of landmark affordable housing portfolio transactions. Dr. Chen is a postdoctoral research associate with the Center in Toronto with the Center for Global Engineering's Sustainable Peri-Urbanization Initiative. He received his PhD in sociology and MA in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on housing and urban development in Latin America and East Asia from a community-based and comparative perspective. He's conducted research in Mexico, Cuba, and China. Helen Harris is the senior manager of the Center for Housing Excellence at the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association in Canada, where she works with a team on policy, research, and education initiatives to lead transformation in Ontario's community housing sector. Her career has focused on community housing, and she has worked in a variety of policy-focused and frontline housing roles. She holds a BA in psychology, a Master of Social Work, and a Master in Public Policy and Administration. And finally, Dr. John Akudago is a Director for International Shelter Initiative at Habitat for Humanity International. He has an environmental science background. He is passionate about water and sanitation related issues and their impact on health and the environment. He's worked in Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Dr. Akudago has contributed greatly to solutions to health, disaster management, poverty reduction, climate change, energy, education, and food security. He has over 20 years experience in international development and disaster risk reduction response. Dr. Akudago responded to some of the world's most dangerous disasters, including the Haiti earthquake and Japan's tsunami and nuclear disaster. So a really great and experienced lineup, and we will, I guarantee, learn a lot from them. So Helen Collins, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll get started.
Bob, thank you very much indeed to you for the invitation to join you today. I'm delighted to have an international outing, even if it is from the comfort of my home office. But I will share my screen in a second. But like you, you can never learn enough, can you, or look out enough. So I'm greatly looking forward to hearing from my fellow speakers today. Right, let's get the scary bit out of the way and just make sure that my screen will share okay. Can you see that? Is that okay on your screens? Great. Okay, right. So thank you for having me. Just one second. I'm just going to adjust my screen my side so I can see you all. Okay, so very briefly, thank you for the kind introduction, Bob. Just in terms of Savills, Savills UK has been going for over 150 years. The business has grown out of the UK into a leading property agent with offices globally, right across the Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa. But the affordable housing team is based in the UK, and I'm proud to say that we are the largest specialist affordable housing team of any of the large property advisors. There are 100 of us. We've been going for 30 years. The team has kept growing for 30 years. And really, we advise on every facet of affordable housing supply, funding, and management in the UK and beyond. So I won't go through the list, but we are, we are multifaceted. So that's a little bit about Savills. So just in terms of housing, affordable housing in the UK, a quick sort of history tour, I guess, and three key words: so philanthropy, capitalism, and the state. And the roots of affordable housing in the UK, as I'm sure you know, go back thousands of years, really, to the almshouse movement in the 1200s, but more recently, in the 19th century, some of the great philanthropists, the Rowntree, Cadbury, were appalled at the living conditions of their workers and built new model villages to sort of spawn a new era of good quality, affordable housing. And then in the early 20th century, it was the state, local authorities and the state that built huge swathes of public sector housing pre and post Second World War. And then moving on into the third phase of supply from the late 1980s, housing associations, non-profit housing associations, have been the dominant providers of new supply, and a great marriage of government capital funding in the form of grant and private finance. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then much more recently, very exciting, we had some legislation passed over here that enabled some new entrants to come into the UK supply of affordable housing. And the reason they've come in is you can now distribute profits arising from operating affordable housing. So we have a number of new entrants in the sector to complement the charitable non-profits. Quick headline, what does it look like? There are 24 million households in the UK. And as you can see from this slide in the centre, we've got housing associations, traditional housing associations, also known as registered providers. It means the same thing, own about 2.4 million homes. Local authorities, 1.6 million. And then these new entrants, you know, it's only about 10,000 homes now, but that's set to grow very quickly indeed. So we've got about 4.3 million homes, just under 20% of their total stock. I think what's important to sort of clock is that around 30% of the working age population in the UK is unable to afford market priced housing, whether that is to buy or to rent. So there is a very significant demand and a structural undersupply in the UK of affordable housing. And that's in spite of this 150-year plus legacy of a relatively focused policy environment. So we have this structural shortfall. Our research team reckon that we need about 100,000 new sub-market homes to rent and buy each year to meet demand. We supply the long run average is about 40,000. So you can see why why there is a huge sort of pent up demand. Just turning to this phenomenon of new entrants into the affordable housing market, you may recognize some of the logos on this slide, you may not, but these are a combination of insurance funds and pension funds managers in the UK and beyond who may have lent debt to affordable housing providers for many years. But since we had this legislation passed a few years ago now that enabled them to set up their own housing association or registered provider, all of the organisations on this slide have now become housing associations, and they are investing in affordable housing supply, bringing new equity into the sector, which is good news, to own and operate affordable housing in the long term to make a return. And the returns that are achievable from sub-market housing are very low and boring, but they are very well matched to pension funds and long-term income, where their liabilities match well with a sector that generates returns of around 4.5%, there or thereabouts, net initial yield, which, as I say, it's not very stellar, but it is reliable and long-term. So we have the latest wave of equity coming into this sector. Just a little bit on the UK policy context before I get to the main event and talk about shared ownership. There's Boris at the top, you'll recognise him, and underneath is Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities. So housing supply of all 10 years has been a key priority of government for around 10 years. So that's good news. And affordable housing supply within that. The Conservative government has always favoured home ownership tenures and pathways to home ownership. So you see a strong commitment to affordable. There's about £12 billion of funding available for new affordable supply over the next 5 years. That will produce about 180,000 homes. In addition to that, about 20,000 homes a year come through the planning system. The emphasis at the moment is that at least half of those homes will be for shared ownership, which Bob's asked me to talk about. So there is a commitment. It's scalable. You can see how many homes are coming into the system. Those new market entrants that I've mentioned are important because they're focused on new supply, and you'll see the reference to 0C by 2050. The UK has committed to decarbonising the economy by 2050, as you know, and residential property forms a big part of hitting that target. So social landlords are committed to decarbonising the affordable housing stock in the UK. Let's say it's going to cost an extra £20,000 a property on top of whatever it was that they were planning on spending anyway. it's going to constrain their ability to build supply, possibly. So there's a good commitment. There is a structural flow of capital that has come into affordable housing from successive governments since 1988. This is just a bit of the architecture. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we've got the government, which is committed, as I've said. It channels funding through the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the Secretary of State is a cabinet level portfolio. And then you have grant funding coming out to providers through the Mayor of London and Homes England, 2 government agencies push the grant out. We've got a national policy around planning to produce affordable housing, so that's at a national level. And then individual local authorities, there are over 400 in the UK, will interpret national policy and supply affordable housing. On the right-hand side, it's a regulated sector. There are 3 key regulators. The regulator of social housing regulates landlord entities. The Housing Ombudsman looks after the quality of homes, and the building and the health and safety executive looks after building safety, which has been a massive agenda here, particularly since the Grenfell fire, which is a terrible tragedy, which you may have seen on the international news in 2017. So regulated and lots of standards. Bob asked me to talk about shared ownership, which is something that you don't have in the States at the moment. It's a tenure that has been around since the 90s, as you can see there on the slide. We're just transitioning from an old style shared ownership to a new style shared ownership. So kind of whistle-stop tour of what shared ownership is about. This is to help people access home ownership that can't afford to buy on the open market. It's really simple. It's part rent, part buy. So the government gives the housing associations some capital grant to build a new home. And then the shared owner, the purchaser, can buy 25% or 50%, whatever they can afford, in a conventional way with a conventional mortgage. And they pay a rent on the share that they don't own to the landlord. They can buy future chunks of equity to own outright over time. And they have full repairing and insuring liability from day one, even if they only own 25%. It's an owner occupation model. They have the full liability. Now, the new model shared ownership is broadly similar, but you can access home ownership at 10% initial equity. You can staircase, buy more chunks in 1% chunks, which is new. And the landlord will help with repairs for the first 10 years. And that's responding to criticisms of the product from homeowners who just felt it was unfair that they had to bear all of the repairs when they didn't own all of the property. If the shared owner comes to sell, then they make any uplift on their share of the property. So there's capital appreciation potential, and also then for the landlord that's provided it. Really quickly, who lives in it? You can see from this slide that on the left-hand side, you've got people that are renting, either in the private rented sector or in the affordable housing sector. And that's, the challenge with the private rented sector is stability. Sometimes your landlord may decide that they don't want to have that property for rented anymore. They want to sell it on. Whereas shared ownership, affordable home ownership, it's your own home, keep up with the mortgage, keep up with the rent, it's there. So it's become a kind of a core plank of UK affordable housing. It's a definite niche for people that don't have, I'll just skip over that one, don't have enough deposit or enough income to get a mortgage. Generally, shared ownership residents tend to be on the younger side, but actually it meets a range of needs. So you can see that shared ownership there is in the darker orange bars, that when you look at all shared ownership, it tends to be smaller, younger households. But there's a reference to Halo there on that slide. Halo is a new market entrant, a shared ownership specialist. And they've targeted their marketing and actually have attracted a lot of downsizers into the product for obvious reasons. So you know that you don't have to be a first-time buyer. There are income caps that are applied by government of £80,000 outside of London, 90,000 in. But beyond that, it's open to people that might have had a relationship breakdown. So maybe they've got some equity from the former marital home, but they don't earn much. Be first-time buyers, downsizers, all sorts of people benefit from it. And that's just some information which shows the sort of income distribution. It's a lower income product. And it's more affordable. When you look at, it's quite a busy slide, our research team like lots of colours. But you can see that the shared ownership on the right-hand side, if you're buying in at 25% or 10%, the deposit that you need is very low indeed. And the minimum income that you need, let's look at 25%, is £30,000 in the UK, which is half the amount that you would need to buy outright. So it's definitely tapping in. Long term, of course, you're paying rent on your unowned equity. And if you never staircase, that rent goes up by RPI plus a half every year. So in time, actually the costs, the monthly costs of ownership will catch up with other tenures and becomes less affordable. There are about 200,000 homes. It's a very small part of the market, but it's set to grow rapidly because of government support. On the left-hand side, you've got there the distribution of shared ownership. On the right-hand side, the government has another product called Help to Buy, which is 20% equity loan, which is operating at greater scale. So in summary, shared ownership has been around for 30 years. Despite that, there are still only a couple of 100,000, but it's set to grow rapidly with further government support from a home ownership orientated government who's here to stay, I guess, for the next 5 years or so. For the government, it's great. It fits with their pathways to home ownership narrative. It's lower capital grant than building a house for rent. It's well established and it's complementary to other home ownership initiatives in the market. For landlords, for housing associations, it's become core. You know, they do see it as meeting a broader range of needs and a recognition that it's not all about homes for rent. You need pathways to ownership. And for the landlord, it gives them a blend of future capital receipts when people staircase or sell on, plus that very stable rental stream increasing with inflation each year. And lenders and investors, they like the revenue potential of shared ownership, which is where some of these new investors, the insurance and pension funds, see a great potential, which is why they're keen to actually build some of this stuff and buy it and own it in the long term. So that's an overview of shared ownership in the UK. I hope that was helpful and look forward to the Q&A later in the session.
Thank you so much, Helen. That yeah, shared ownership is really a different concept for us here in this country. So I'm sure we're going to have some questions about it as we get to the Q&A. So we'll shift to you.
So share my screen. So can you see the screen? Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me in this panel. I look forward very much to discussing the social housing development, affordable housing development experiences, like international experiences cross-border with the panelists and also the audience. So my name is Chen, and I'm a postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto. And so I bring to this talk the affordable housing experiences in two middle-income countries, that is China and Mexico. And this is based on my dissertation project, in which I compared the social housing development experiences in these two countries. So here I define social housing as a form of housing production supported by the public sector, aiming to improve the housing access and housing condition among the low-income population. So I conducted 2 case studies in Nanjing, China, which is also my hometown, and Guadalajara, Mexico, the second largest metropolitan areas in Mexico, respectively. Both cities are provincial capitals. And here is some contextual information. So in today's talk, I want to first talk about China and then Mexico. It's kind of challenging to go through like these 2 cases in just 15 minutes. So I'm going to focus on the broad features. And if you have questions regarding the details, I'll be more than happy to answer the questions in the Q&A session. So all the images you see here are taken by myself during the field work. And most of the images are of the social housing projects in Nanjing and in Guadalajara. So following the 2008 global financial crisis, China launched a nationwide social housing campaign as part of the stimulus package, as well as a response to the widespread social discontent against the deterioration of housing affordability. In general, social housing in China has two broad types. The first one is economical housing, and the second one is public rental housing. Both types are heavily subsidized by the state. Public rental housing is straightforward, and for economical housing, the ownership is shared between the low-income home buyer and the local government. So economical housing can also be resold to the market, but part of the revenue has to be remitted to the local government. So the central government established a goal to build 36 million social housing dwellings nationwide during its 12th five-year development plan, 2011 to 2015. That task was subdivided and delegated to provincial governments, and then from provincial governments to municipal governments. Municipal governments are responsible for leading almost the entire process of social housing development in their jurisdiction, from planning, land allocation, financing the projects, subcontracting the construction, allocating the social housing units to the target population, and to the maintenance of those housing projects. They do receive a partial and limited funding support from upper level governments. What I found is that instead of manipulating statistics or passively resisting the orders from above, in the city of Nanjing, authorities were actually very proactive in promoting social housing development. So between 2010 and 2015, the municipal government produced more than 200,000 social housing units. This is somehow like surprising because leading social housing development is such a cumbersome and costly, challenging task in both economic and administrative terms. Municipal governments only receive partial funding support from upper level governments. And so my research question was, one of my research questions was actually what motivated the municipal governments to promote social housing development in Nanjing. And my conclusion is that social housing is using in Nanjing as a policy tool for local governments to lead urbanization process and to facilitate the spatial expansion and the territorial reorganization of the city. In order to promoting infrastructure and real estate development projects such as industrial parks, CBDs, subways. In the case of Nanjing and many other Chinese cities, this is translated into the relocation and displacement of a large number of households, urban and rural households. To illustrate this infrastructure boom in Nanjing, for example, the city's first metro line was inaugurated in 2005. And today the system has 10 lines and the system length reached 235 miles. And that is only 13 miles shorter than the New York City subway system. In tandem with this infrastructure boom, however, is the scale of the demolition of entire urban rural neighborhoods. Between 1999 and 2014, more than 220,000 housing units in Nanjing were demolished for the purpose of urban renewal and or infrastructure development. So in the city, in the 1990s and early 2000s, urbanization-related demolition caused numerous confrontations and sometimes very violent confrontations between affected neighborhoods and the local authorities over the demolition decision and the compensation. As the compensation is determined by the land value of the neighborhood and the condition, the size of the property, low-income population often received a very meager monetary compensation due to the small size of their dwellings. And even they agreed to leave with the compensation money to receive, they could not afford to buying a new property. So in response, the municipal government of Nanjing started building large number of social housing dwellings, most of them economical housing of shared ownership. offering them to low-income households affected by the urbanization-related demolition. Between 2005 and 2015, 95% of social housing units built in Nanjing were economical housing. The vast majority of them were allocated to relocated households. A key factor for us to understanding the infrastructure boom and local governments' aggressive behavior in promoting urbanization in China is the country's urban land regime. We don't have time to discuss in detail the historical evolution of land regime in China, but it is important to note that there is no private land in China. All the urban land is public ownership and rural land is communal ownership. So rural land in certain circumstances can be expropriated by the municipal governments and converted to urban land after offering a compensation to the peasants. And in Nanjing, this compensation often includes social housing dwellings. Although in China, land ownership is inalienable, land use right has been commercialized. So when we talk about land market in China, we refer to the market of the land use right. Local governments monopolize the supply of land use right in the primary land market. Land use right is leased out in highly competitive public auctions to commercial developers by municipal governments. Developers are required to make upfront payments for the entire land lease. Revenues that local governments receive from leasing out land use rights sometimes can surpass tax revenues. More importantly, local governments also use its land reserve as a collateral to apply for loans or other finances. In other words, many local governments in China have a parallel finance machine besides the general tax revenues. Often you will see local governments use tax revenues for its daily operation and social expenditures, and use the land lease revenues to finance development and infrastructure projects. That is why they have so strong incentives to hold tight control over land and have strong interest in pursuing rising land value through real estate and infrastructure projects and even gentrification. In my survey, dwellers' experiences of moving into social housing projects in Nanjing are highly diverse. One of my main critiques to the Nanjing model is its paternalistic nature. You deserve a social housing only because the location of your home is desirable for the municipal government. And you don't have much say in that decision-making process. Now coming to the Mexican case, social housing in Mexico is essentially subsidized commercial housing. It is produced by private developers and is sold on open market. It's supposed to target the low income, lower middle income, and low income working class affiliated to the public housing finance agencies. The most important agency of this type is the Institute of National Fund for Workers' Housing, the Infonavit, as you can see the logo upper right. It's essentially a compulsory saving program. In Mexico, employers in the private sector, for example, are required to make a monthly contribution to their employees' Infonavit account that equals 5% of the employee's salary. Employees can apply for mortgages or credits from the Infonavit for purposes such as housing acquisition, housing construction on one's own land, housing improvement, etc. Between 2005 and 2012, for example, Infonavit issued around 400,000 to 500,000 credits each year. Some 60% of those credits were granted to lower income, lower middle and low income workers, which involved either upfront subsidies or other types of implicit subsidies. Social housing boom in Mexico was triggered by a series of reforms in the 1990s aiming to foster participation of the private sector in housing development. These reforms were oriented towards the deregulation of urban housing development and the financialization of the housing policy. For example, inflation-indexed mortgages were introduced, financial products in the mortgage market were diversified. In 2003, the Infonavit started to issue mortgage-backed securities, which broadened its sources of revenue. And the Infonavit largely reinforced its financial discipline with much less tolerance of non-performing loans. The role of the public sector in Mexico's social housing boom is critical. Between 2005 and 2010, for example, the market share of public institutions in real estate lending was around 2/3. Public housing finance agencies and subsidies offered by the public sector reduced the entry barrier of the mortgage for low-income workers. While in the 1960s and 1970s, the private sector did not quite have the resources or incentives to invest in low-income housing, and self-help housing in informal settlement became the most common housing options for urban low-income working class. In the 2000s, social housing became a highly profitable business. The mortgage boom triggered by the transformation of the Infonavit created a pool of potential home buyers and increased the certainty for developers. Mexico's social housing boom has two very serious problems. First, the mortgage that the low-income social housing buyers contract are often for 20 to 30 years. However, in a highly volatile labor market, they face high risk of unemployment and thus the disruption of mortgage payments. Foreclosure is a real threat. Second, at local level, municipal governments are supposed to regulate social housing development through urban planning and provide basic services after the project is municipalized. However, due to the limited planning capacity and corruption, local authorities often turn a blind eye and easily approved a large amount of these social housing projects in the far periphery of the city where land is cheap but lack basic infrastructure and service. So these are two problems largely contribute to the abandonment in many, the housing abandonment crisis in many Mexican cities. So to wrap up, these two systems are powerful, very powerful in producing a large number of so-called social housing dwellings in short period of time. However, what we see here is that social policy is used as a tool and a venue to facilitate the advancement of neoliberal projects, such as financialization towards low-income population, disguised as a form of welfare that targets certain vulnerable social groups. Groups in power use social policy to effectively impose their agenda on the target population. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. One number that really jumped out to me in your presentation was the goal in China to build 36 million public housing units in 5 years. That's I know things are done on a much larger scale there, but that's still an astonishing goal. And maybe if we get a chance at the end, I'll like to hear how well that went and whether that was achieved. But right now, let's switch to Helen Harris, also in Toronto, and Helen's going to talk to us a little bit about her nonprofit housing association work.
Thank you so much, Bob, and I hope everyone can see my screen. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that introduction, and to Housing Forward Virginia for inviting me to participate in this panel today and hear the wonderful presentations from my co-panelists. Before moving into my remarks, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the land that I'm joining you from. I'm joining you today from my home in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. These lands have been the site of human activity for 15,000 years and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So I will start off today by telling you a little bit about the association I'm joining you from and the current context in Ontario and Canada more broadly. And then we'll speak about why our organization feels strongly that investment in nonprofit or community housing is the best investments government can make, and some of the policy interventions and strategies that we've been advocating for and that we think are key to incentivizing and encouraging this type of development. And finally, when speaking with Bob and preparing for this panel, he'd mentioned that many attendees might be interested in hearing about strategies for combating Nimbyism and opposition to affordable housing development. So I'll finish off by sharing some of the key strategies we promote at ONFA as part of a broader training course on affordable housing development and redevelopment. So jumping right in, I am joining you today from the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, which is an independent, member-funded and directed association representing community housing providers in the province of Ontario, Canada. We represent about 730 social housing providers or nonprofit housing providers across Ontario. Our smallest provider operates, I think, 3 units. Our biggest provider operates 60,000 units, so quite a range within our membership. We do a number of things, including education, training, and professional development, and of course, policy and advocacy and research work. So to provide a bit of context, across Canadian provinces and territories, there are approximately 600,000 community housing units. And again, when I use the term community housing, I'm really referring to housing that we may also, or you may also refer to or understand as social housing or public housing. And this number includes housing that is owned and operated by nonprofit corporations, co-op corporations, as well as governments, government agencies. And of these 600,000 units across Canada, approximately 260,000, so about half, are located in Ontario. And these units provide homes for almost 500,000 Ontarians, representing about 3.5% of our province's population. And despite having a strong and innovative community housing sector, Ontario and Canada have been facing increasing challenges that I'm sure many in your locations have been too. And really some of the key ones are that as housing ownership gets further out of reach for much of the population, the supply of affordable rental housing and non-market alternatives are not coming close to keeping up with demand, resulting in ballooning waiting lists for affordable housing and increased rates of homelessness. And though we really haven't seen the full impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic yet, because of quick responses through support programs and emergency orders, we do expect these challenges will continue to worsen significantly over the coming months as supports come to an end and eviction moratoriums are lifted over the coming months. The other big problem for Canada is that after a significant amount of government investment was made through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the lack of investment over the past several decades has not only meant that supply has not come close to keeping up with demand, but it's also meant that our aging stock is falling into various states of disrepair and really at risk of being lost. And so while these are big challenges, again, many of which I'm sure you're also facing in your local context, we're also seeing some pretty big sea changes in the Canadian narrative about housing and the importance that is being placed on access to safe and affordable places to live. So first and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shone a light on the connections between individual and public health and housing like never before. And more broadly, and this is specific to Canada, although I'm sure would be playing out in various ways across jurisdictions, the historical operating and funding agreements tied to housing units that were developed 35 to 50 years ago in Canada, when I mentioned the Canadian government was making significant investment, they're starting to come to an end, which is forcing all levels of government and providers to re-engage about what will come next for the sector. So what we're seeing now is that all of these factors are converging into an increased federal re-engagement through a relatively recent national housing strategy for Canada, which is the first of its kind and was introduced in 2018. And more recently, increased investment and in interest in rapid housing solutions as a direct result to the pandemic, as well as a significant legislative and regulatory change environment happening at both our provincial and municipal levels. And all of these factors and developments are offering ONFA and others really great opportunities for us to advocate and promote community housing as a key part of socioeconomic recovery and the best investment that government can make. So why community housing as opposed to other interventions? And we've identified a number of reasons for this. So first, research has shown that investment in community housing interventions can result in improved community level social, education, and health outcomes. And stemming directly from this, These improved population outcomes also result in significant cost savings and benefits for other systems. So recent Canadian studies have shown that for every $10 spent on housing and supports for those that are chronically homeless, approximately $22 is saved in costs related to healthcare, the justice system, shelters, and other social supports. Next, we know that investment in community housing development creates jobs and stimulates the economy. We found that developing one affordable housing unit is estimated to generate between 2 and 2.5 new jobs. And a recent Canadian report found that for every dollar invested in residential building construction, Canada's GDP introduced by $1.52. And finally, and one of the most important reasons for investing in community housing as opposed to some other interventions, which are also equally important, but need to be done in concert with investing in community housing, is that this investment is protected and can be leveraged to provide affordable housing options over the long term. What we've seen far too often is that affordable housing investment, when it goes into private sector developments, there's a requirement to maintain affordability for a certain period of time, usually about 10 to 20 years. And when this time period is up, communities are left seeing rents skyrocket, and tenants and organizations are left scrambling to find affordable alternatives. On the other hand, community housing providers are mission-driven and committed to providing affordable housing over the long term and would continue to offer affordable rents in perpetuity. And not only that is this initial public investment protected over the long term, by investing in community housing, it can actually serve to increase affordable housing options exponentially over decades as community housing providers build their portfolios and their equity and can then leverage their assets to drive their organizational missions forward and create even more affordable housing for their communities. So with that value proposition being what it is, ONFA is very focused on advocating for a number of policy interventions and strategies we believe are key to incentivizing and encouraging the sustainability and growth of community housing. And so I'll talk about just a few of these today. So the first and really big one that we advocate for within policy development and program development is that there needs to be a prioritization for the nonprofit housing sector in funding programs and initiatives. And what we've seen when there's kind of, these general programs for development that both nonprofit and private can compete for, nonprofits just really don't have the ability to compete. Often private sector entities have shovel-ready projects that they can jump at these funding initiatives, but that nonprofits don't have. So we recommend that there's a carve out within programs to produce community housing specifically. Second, and very closely related to that, we recommend that governments and policymakers provide access to seed funding or pre-development funding as part of housing development initiatives, again, so that community housing providers can do the work that they need on that pre-development work and pre-application work to be able to compete for that funding. The third thing we recommend is don't neglect the maintenance of existing assets. What we see so often in funding programs, and it's the desire, I think, for politicians to be able to cut the new ribbon and introduce the groundbreaking and show the new housing, which is wonderful. But on the other hand, there is also a stock that needs to be maintained. And what we've seen with our national housing strategy specifically is that what's happening in Canada is that we're actually losing close to 4 units, 4 affordable rental housing units for every 1 unit that the national housing strategy is creating. And so this creates a huge problem. And we're celebrating the development, which of course we should, but at the same time, we're actually losing stock. And so closely related to that one is the recommendation that the data collection needs to be prioritized to support evidence-based decision-making and funding allocations, both in terms of maintenance of stock, but also in terms of the communities that are being served. We also recommend that governments support nonprofit acquisition of rental properties, including rental assets, hotels, and motels for the purpose of bolstering emergency and long-term housing supply. And finally, that governments reinvest and earmark any housing-related tax revenues, such as land transfer taxes, vacancy taxes, non-resident speculation taxes, back into the provision of the creation of community housing and affordable housing initiatives. So the final thing I'd like to talk to you about today is combating Nimbyism in opposition to affordable development. And as I've mentioned, when I was speaking with Bob around preparing for this, he shared that many attendees would be interested in hearing some of the strategies community housing providers in Ontario use to combat this. We offer a broader training course on affordable housing development that tackles this subject as a topic. So I'll share some of the key recommendations and strategies we promote to our members who are thinking about embarking on projects. And while there are, of course, many unique factors that need to be considered around planning approvals and local context, there are some pretty common themes and strategies regardless of location and situation. And the first common theme is that even the most seasoned project proponents and developers can count on facing at least some level of opposition and public resistance to your project at some point in the process. And even if there is demonstrated need for more housing in your community and the value proposition is strong, not everyone will be in support of the development or how you plan to address the issue. And this is really where we start to see the NIMBY or the not in my backyard sentiments starting to emerge. And we know that oftentimes the concerns that we hear cited around declining property values or increased traffic or increased crime are really just masking more deeply held perceptions or biases related to the tenants that, that groups are planning to serve. So knowing that, that some form of opposition is likely to occur in the process, we recommend that developers and organizations ask themselves some key questions at the outset to minimize impacts, build support, and position themselves to succeed. And these questions are, what concerns and pressures are you likely to face and from who? What approvals are you likely to need to move your project forward? What support do you absolutely need to move forward, as opposed to what support would be beneficial to have? And who can help you gain the support and approvals you'll need? And once those questions have been answered, we recommend that organizations should develop a formal stakeholder engagement plan for building support, which should identify the various stakeholders, potential issues, and areas where approvals and support will be required. And a successful plan should incorporate a plan to engage in public consultation as soon as there is something meaningful to discuss, a plan for written updates to be circulated as opposed to just verbal updates in order to avoid misinformation. Hold open houses and meetings to explain tangible benefits and to counter expected opposition. Identification of key partners and influential supporters. And this is a really key one, and the recognition that you don't have to do it all alone. You can find out what else is being done in your community and align with projects and groups that have the same values, and also identify influential people such as trusted local figures, public politicians, planners, and political advisors who can help spread and build support for your project and potentially be called on to help influence decision-making and approval processes. And the last one I'll speak to is a plan to engage existing or potential tenants. And the recommendation that tenants should not be forgotten as an important stakeholder group, particularly when undertaking a redevelopment project, as it will greatly impact their residences. The other key thing you need to consider is how you'll approach your communications. Being organized is one of the best things that providers and developers can do for yourself and your project. And with that in mind, having a communication plan to guide actions is a useful way to coordinate and stay on message. And we recommend that a successful communications plan for a development project should include important process and project milestones, identification of stakeholders and their roles, key messaging for promoting the project and responding to opposition, proposed methods for communicating, and a designated spokesperson or people for the project. So it's critical that as an organization, you speak with one voice, and having a designated spokesperson and managing messages helps avoid miscommunication among the stakeholders and the broader public. So I realize that, and I know my time is almost up, and while this has only scratched the surface of how organizations can start thinking about combating opposition to affordable housing development, I hope it's given some useful strategies to think about as a starting point. And I just want to leave you with a series of questions that we recommend organizations continue asking themselves when they are faced with NIMBY. And those are here on the screen. So what opportunities do you see in your community to build support? How can you create a constructive dialogue with those that are opposing your project? Who are the influential stakeholders in the community that could support your cause? And what are the most effective ways to get your message out? So with that, I thank Housing Forward Virginia again for inviting me to be part of this today. Encourage everyone to reach out to us at OMFA or to take a look at some of the research and policy recommendations that we have on our website. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I guess I'm a little comforted to hear that we're not the only ones who have NIMBY issues, and that this is maybe an area where we can stay in touch, because one of the key missions of Housing Forward Virginia for years has been helping affordable housing providers with tools to overcome NIMBY. So it sounds like you're doing a lot of the same kind of work. So let's keep the dialogue open. Our last presenter is John Akudago. And John, I will turn it over to you. And if you can stay within the 15-minute time limit, we'll have at least 15 or so minutes at the end for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, and I'm so glad to be on the panel with everyone here. When I was preparing for this, Bob asked me to talk on how we manage on the service delivery part. So I am going to focus more on the service delivery instead of talking about more on housing. But I'm glad to hear some of the progress that has gone on in many countries. So we all know that Habitat is an organization that is focused on housing, and Habitat believes that everybody needs a decent place to live as a home. And a place cannot be decent without access to water and sanitation services. So what my presentation is going to be looking at is the services that need to go with the house. And that is what you are going to be hearing from me. And today around the world, we are talking about 1.2 billion people living in substandard housing, with 1 billion people living in slums. Now, we all know that when you even talk about housing in slums, they are not within the context of the housing that we are seeing on the presentations today. They lack basic services, and they are not in a very good place, condition for you to live in. And it is estimated that by 2030, 3 billion people will lack access to adequate housing. And that means this would also influence the services that need to go with those houses. So Habitat is working in over 70 countries to help address the housing need. And we believe that a house should go with water and sanitation as well. So we all know that a decent home should be a place where you have secure tenure. We should have cultural adequacy, location accessibility, habitability, and affordability. And the last one should be, you should have services such as water and sanitation. The challenge is that we still have a big issue in the water and sanitation area. Globally, over 2.3 billion people lack access to sanitation, adequate sanitation, and 800 million people lack access to safe water. Even when you narrow it to the US, for example, more than 2 million Americans live without water and then basic indoor plumbing. And about 1.4 million people lack access to indoor plumbing and cold, and do not have access to maybe hot or cold running water. So this is actually impacting housing. It is not only just the building that we have, but the services inside the house contributes to the health outcomes that we are looking for from the house. So looking at this, most of the challenges that we face as an international group is that we get to some places and these services are not existing. When you look at the developed world, like you are talking about China or Canada or the US, there are already laid down systems where when you finish the house, you just hook the house to the water and sanitation systems. Unfortunately, this may not happen in many developing countries. The house may be 100 miles away from a source of water, or even the house could be several miles away from a toilet. So how do you manage to get this? Now, the toilet or water and sanitation in general is a system that interacts with different components. It interacts with the ability to pay, the economic power of the person living in it, in the house. It also interacts with the technology that you use, whether the technology is good enough to save the people and the environment from further contaminations. And then social status. We want to make sure that everything that we also have there is culturally acceptable. We also have to have political and institutional policies around water and sanitation and the service delivery, because if it is not affordable, that means that the government is not able to play a role in controlling how much should be given to the people. And then the environment. We want to make sure that everything that we are doing is environmentally sustainable and does not go to cause another problem. So usually water and sanitation systems, the installation cost is very expensive. It's very hard to talk about going into a whole new place and bringing in services to cater for a whole town or a city. Operation and maintenance is also something that when you put any services on the ground, it's still going to be requiring routine maintenance, and then some cost will be incurred and people have to pay for that. And then we also have to talk about post-installation support costs. The systems are not just there for you to use forever. They must be requiring some technical support with time. And who bears these costs? Safe disposal of the final sludge or maybe the waste or excreta that comes from the entire housing team or group or residents is something that we have to be looking at. These are concerns. If we have the house without having safe disposal, that is also going to give us a big problem. Unfortunately, in the developing world, policies sometimes do not exist, or even if they exist, they are very weak. So you might have a house built in a community, but there's no any water even provided in that house. Any person who is going to use that, I mean, maybe the systems, the sanitation systems in that house has to carry water from somewhere and bring it to the house to use. In some cases, we are also dealing with areas where we are dealing with incremental home construction, like the slums, or maybe people would just say, okay, I'm going to build one room this year, and then I will wait for another year to add another room. And so, I mean, access to sanitation and hygiene services in that home would be the last thing to consider, because they are more focused on getting the rooms and not those services. And services are detached from the main house. Like I mentioned earlier on, you can have a whole house in the developing world, whereas the sanitation facilities are like 500 meters away from the house. So this also poses a lot of problems to housing affordability, because if you want to have the sanitation facility, you have to pay upfront cost to cater for the capital cost of installation. And the funny thing is that in some of these areas, you don't even have credit opportunities given to homeowners to install these services. So they can build a house, maybe incrementally, or even build a whole new construction, have everything inside, but there's no any water pool to the place. And the resident has no access to credit to pool this water or sanitation services to the house. And another thing is sanitation services outside the home sometimes would require an additional land. And land can be a challenge, especially if you are dealing with a slum environment where already there's overcrowding because people have moved from other places and they are informally settling in that area because they have no places to live. And the other thing is sometimes homeowners do not even know what kind of environmental friendly technologies they need to install in their homes to be able to access these services so that there are no challenges to the environment or contamination to other neighbors around them, just as we are talking about the NIMBY. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we have done in some of the cases, as Bob told me that audience would want to listen to some of them and see whether they can adopt those technologies in the US. I thought of a system where we have adopted in some of the areas. In slums, for example, it is very difficult to come by land. And then if you also look at them, most of them settle in areas where the condition is just very hard. I mean, it's not the best place to live because it's either a flat area or water table is so high and so on. And if you don't work with them, they are definitely going to be a nuisance to the rest of the population, just as we not in my backyard. So we are going to look at how to address situations like that. because when there is no any sewage system in that area and you are building a home in that area, you are going to support an individual to have a home, or maybe a rural area to have a home. What do we do? So we've run into such issues before, and I just wanted to share a case study from one of the places that we did. So one of the things that we've been thinking of is, if we are trying to provide a sanitation facility to the person or to the resident, will that cause that person to even not be able to pay for his or her mortgage? Because the UN recommends that access to water and sanitation is a right, but you should not pay more than 3 to 5% of your household income. But in some countries, people are even ending up paying between 29 and 50% of their household income to access these services. So if your income is less than maybe $2,000 and you have 50% already going into that service delivery, then how much do you have to pay for your mortgage? That makes the mortgage or maybe the housing unaffordable at that time. So one area we are looking at is the biogas. And the biogas usually is just making sure that the organic waste that is produced in the house, whether it is from your toilets or maybe from the organic materials that is surrounding the house, or maybe even from your kitchen, what you leftovers and things like that, you can use that to support your home and make your home affordable. The biogas consists of about 60 to 70% methane gas. And we all know methane gas is used in cooking. So it is a very laudable thing to talk about, something that you can reduce the costs that you already incur in the house, especially with utilities. It's also about 30 to 40% carbon dioxide. So if you are able to manage that, that means you are also managing how much carbon dioxide you are going to put into the atmosphere. And then it has 4% of water. So if you are able to manage your system with that, then you are going to generate enough water and water to go back to the environment, and that water will be safe. And definitely hydrogen sulfide is a pungent smelling gas. So the biogas would produce about 0.5% of that. And then you have nitrogen, which is also something that you can use as a homeowner to keep your gardens around your home. So an example that I wanted to share is this type of system where we had to construct in the slums of Liberia to be able to manage the waste that is coming out from the whole slum. So this facility that you are seeing is the sanitation facility. We do not have the land to provide everybody at home a sanitation facility, but we have the land to provide multiple people or maybe several households with access to sanitation. And what they do is they would use this whole sanitation facility here, and the waste would go into a septic tank. Now, when this waste gets to the septic tank, because there's no enough oxygen, that waste decomposes and begin to produce gas. That gas is a mixture of so many things, and that is the biogas that we are talking of. So the gas gets filled into this membrane that you have here. And that membrane is actually purposely designed to collect the gas so that later on you can use the gas to do something. Now, you can use the gas in various ways, but the most important thing is when you do this, the water that is going to be generated at the end of the day is safe to return to the environment. So the housing project that you would be building around that place is not going to cause a problem to the environment because there are no policies around how to dispose of the waste from those residents and so on. So I am just looking at this and telling everyone about the benefits of what we do there. One, it is producing fuel for the house owner to use. They can use that fuel to boil their water for bathing. That means they will cut down their utilities in the home. They can also use that fuel even to generate electricity. In some areas, for example, in Ghana, they are using that kind of technology to generate about 2.5 megawatts electricity every day. So if you look at that, there is a possibility that the homeowner can also generate that amount of energy that will be required for him or her to use at home. And then again, the wastewater that is produced after the biogas is generated is safe to be discharged into the environment. Most countries are running out of water already, and we think that no water should go waste. And the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, helps us or tells us that we need to be able to treat whatever wastewater comes to augment the water recharge that we all look forward to. And then the end result of having the biogas and then free water, you also have the free water, which is very rich in nutrients and can be used for agriculture purposes. So if you look at that whole technology, the technology can be adopted in anywhere in the US where you have issues with, let's say, water table in the soil, or where you have lack of access to land to build outdoor sanitation. I know that in the US, you don't do that, but in rural communities, it is possible that you could still be providing housing that needs that.
Hey,
so in conclusion, I want to say that sanitation technologies are very important in the housing sector, because we cannot talk about housing without those services, especially those of us working in rural areas where we have to deal with individual households. It is very important to look at that. We must ensure that we have safe disposal of the excreta, and we must ensure that whatever operations and maintenance costs is going to come with the technology is not going to be a burden to the house owner, who will not be able to afford both the services and mortgage payments. And then also policies around service delivery should be promoted. Some places, it is not a problem if you build a house without a sanitation facility or water in the house. That should be something that we need to advocate and make sure that policies are enforced. And then also, if possible, we should adopt technologies that can have other benefits. It is not very good to be looking at technology in isolation. If there are multiple benefits, that would be the best thing to look at. And in this case, I want to say that if something like this is beneficial to any of the housing projects you have around here, then you might want to conduct research to understand the potential and how to customize it to your needs. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, John, and thanks to all you panelists. I know it's very constrained to have to. You have a lot to communicate and to stay in that. Y'all did a great job staying within your window, and we've got 15 minutes or so for some questions. Let me go to a couple that came up in the Q&A, and I think these. Helen Collins, these both relate to the shared ownership. One is around the ownership of the land. Is that also shared, or is that retained by the original owner? And then secondly, we've got a question around investors active in shared. In the shared ownership model, are there investors that are active both in the UK and the US, and is there a possibility of testing that model here?
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Bob. So picking up on the land question first, the housing association, be it a non-profit or a for-profit housing association, they buy the land and they build the house and they own the freehold. So whether they buy the land off the open market in competition with other developers, that's one model, using government grants to help access it. The other supply route is that through the UK planning system, any development that is given planning permission over a certain size has an automatic percentage of affordable housing that is required to be built on it. And some of that may be shared ownership. and they would acquire it through that mechanism. Either way, the simple answer is it's the landlord, the housing association. They own the land, they build the house, they retain the freehold, and they sell a leasehold share. And then the second question, absolutely, absolutely, in terms of common investors, we've seen all sorts of funds and investment managers come into the UK housing market because they like the products that are getting built over here as an investable position, including a number of really well-known US firms. Blackstone would be a really obvious one. Blackstone owns 90% of a for-profit housing association called Sage Housing. We do quite a bit of work with Sage. And it was quite a landmark moment actually when Blackstone came in. I don't know whether you're familiar with them, but huge private equity sort of residential investor. And their business model is to aggregate at scale. And it's really shaken up the UK or the English housing market, because what they've done is they've bought up loads of those affordable housing homes that are being produced through the planning system here to build a big portfolio of affordable housing really quickly. It's been phenomenal. But the answer is yes. The product has could play a role in all sorts of countries. And as we've said, affordable housing is a global crisis. So it is an exportable product.
When you showed all of those logos, the only one that I recognized was CBRE, which is, of course, a big U.S. Realty firm. So maybe there's a connection there as well. They're active in Virginia, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay, this is for Helen Harris, and it is around NIMBY, which is near and dear to all of our hearts, asking, are the strategies that you recommend different based on the type of community you're in? If you're in, for example, a traditional suburban neighborhood that might be more exclusionary with large lots and opposition to density versus an urban gentrifying neighborhood where displacement may also be occurring.
Thanks for that question. So I think I'll start by saying, approaches need to be tailored to the local context in every situation, and there needs to be some sort of tailoring. But I think that the high level strategies that I talked about really would apply across all situations. So the strategies around stakeholder engagement, media engagement, holding public meetings, thinking about who would be the spokesperson. What I think would change would be the type of messaging. I think that in those situations, the concerns and the opposition and what is being brought forward as terms of being the reasons for opposition would be different. So I think it would be more a matter of massaging messaging and potentially massaging, the way things are communicated and how things are communicated, as opposed to different overall strategies in terms of managing the communication and managing the stakeholder engagement.
A couple of questions for you, Chen. First, the experience of households that are being displaced in China for development, how are those households compensated, or do they have a priority for new housing that's being built? And then a second question, which is just around the type of housing that's being built, the size of the apartment, what is typical in terms of the really large scale housing development that's happening.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thanks for raising this issue. So in general, the compensation is in monetary terms. So it's determined by the land value of the neighborhood, the size and condition of the old dwelling, and also sometimes the size of the household. So the problem for many relocated urban households is because their original dwelling is so small, in those very precarious neighborhoods. And so the compensation they're receiving is very little and not sufficient for them to buy another dwelling. So that's the reason why in this case, usually they're offered social housing. and social housing is more like is subsidized by the state. So with the monetary compensation, usually like you can get a larger apartment than your previous dwelling. And in the rural neighborhoods, rural communities is a little bit different because the rural dwellings usually are larger size. And so, for example, you can receive like 240 square meters floor area of social housing. And then a strategy that many rural households use is to, instead of requesting like 2 social housing apartments, each 120 square meters, they would prefer like 3 smaller housing units so that they can keep one, they can get like leave one for their children, and another one like for like renting purposes, and in this way like they receive an extra income. So it's highly diverse, but in general it's monetary term, and the social housing comes when there's like the monetary compensation is too low.
Thank you. John, there's a question, do you have a definition or some guideposts for how one would measure cultural adequacy in housing? Cultural adequacy, I think maybe was a term that was in your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. In every society, you have the traditional way of doing things before maybe other foreign designs might come to them. For example, you might go to some areas, they believe in having their houses all roofed with thatched maybe grass or something. You get to some places, even the design of their sanitation facilities must accommodate their religious beliefs and so on. So there are so many things that culture plays in the design of the house. The house, I mean, just getting a place to live, if you are renting, you have no problem. But if you are designing a house for your own, you would definitely have certain things that you want to look at culturally, especially if the environment you live has a cultural belief of certain type of designs. Or if they all believe that, let's take it that this area, we all have to have all our roofs being tiles, you have to go with whatever is in that area. So culturally, we need to take that into consideration. But I can check for the indicators that would be used to measure, and then I can get back to you with answers.
Thank you. There's one other question in the chat, and I think it maybe could be for any of you. I think maybe for the two Helens, and that is, do you find that investors are buying up houses, subdividing, renting them out, continuing to edge out the possibility for younger households or households with lower incomes to be able to get into home ownership? Is that a challenge that you see in the markets that you're working in?
Do you want to go, Helen?
You go ahead. I think that question came in for you primarily, so you go ahead and I can jump in.
This has been a massive problem in the past. I think it's becoming less of a problem, mostly because most of the conversions have been done over the last 20 years. So conversions of small terraced houses into effectively student accommodation, where actually you might not adapt the accommodation, but landlords have bought them up and then rented out the bedrooms plus the living room to students for much more rental income than it would garner as a family home. So that's taken out a big chunk of sort of the traditional first time buyer, more affordable homes. And then when you look at the big cities like London in particular, houses in multiple occupation. So again, acquisition of large Victorian houses, say, converted into multiple small units, generating huge amounts of revenue, high rents at the maximum that the state will support through the housing benefit system. So yes, there has been a significant amount of housing that has moved into that temporary accommodation or student or houses in multiple occupation for the more vulnerable ends of society. And simply for private rented accommodation in high value cities. Yes, it's a problem. What we have got more positively, more recently, is a build to rent or multifamily movement, which you'll be much more familiar with in the US. So this is purpose-built, professionally managed, brand new, private rented accommodation. So putting something back into supply, recognizing that the standards of some of the conversions are just not fit for purpose for modern society, and that's attracting a lot of investment. But we still have a lot of converted property. It's not great. What's really worrying us at the moment is our town centres have suffered massively. It's not just through COVID, but through online shopping. It's not a UK phenomenon, but we have lots of empty units. And the government has made it very easy for those shops to be converted into residential. Now, in theory, residential in town centres sounds great, doesn't it? Breathing life back in. That's okay as long as the standards of that redevelopment or the conversion are good, but they're not always good. Sometimes they're very poor indeed. Lots of very small rooms with no windows, no natural light. So that is a concern.
Yeah, and I just add to that, I agree with everything that Helen has said, and that the erosion of this supply definitely impacts younger and less wealthy individuals' ability to get into the market. The other thing that I think you touched on, briefly in terms of referring to temporary accommodation, the other thing we're seeing is, with things like Airbnb, the taking of stock and for those temporary rentals really impacts too. And I would just say that the impacts for that one section of the market that we're talking about in terms of those trying to get into homeownership then has huge spillover effects down the housing spectrum, because individuals stay those moderately affordable condos or apartments for longer instead of moving on, and then we see community housing waiting lists just ballooning and nowhere for the people who are in community housing to move into those more moderately priced market rental options. So it really has a spillover effect into and across the entire sector.
Well, we're very close to the 11 o'clock mark. Let me finish with a question for each of you, and if you could maybe just do a 30-second response, I'd be curious what your experience is. Here in the U.S., a lot of us who worked in affordable housing for a long time have struggled to have affordable housing become a top-tier policy issue at the national level, at the state level, at the local level. We've really struggled to have housing elevated. And in some ways right now, and maybe partly because of the pandemic, partly for other reasons, we're seeing housing and funding for housing at really high levels, unprecedented high levels. So I'm kind of curious, in the countries that you are working in, whether you think that in terms of the visibility of housing and support for affordable housing, is that improving, staying the same, or do you have concerns about it slipping off of the priority list? So Helen Harris, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Bob. And so definitely agree. I think that, as I'd mentioned in my remarks too, housing has never been more central in Canada than right now. We're seeing increased policy attention, increased funding. I am concerned about it. And so the reason I think is definitely because of the COVID-19 pandemic and, housing, in a pandemic, when we say the best line of defense is home, if people don't have an affordable home, it becomes very challenging to have that as a first line of defense. So I think that has woken a lot of people up to the challenges. And I think the other reason that that it's become such a big thing right now is it's starting to impact the middle income earners and the kids of the baby boomers who can't afford a house. And I think that is really why it's become such a central issue. I do worry about it becoming less central over the coming years. So I think we all have a huge responsibility to make sure it stays right center stage and on the political agenda.
Thank you. How about in Asia or in Latin America? Where do you think things are headed?
Yes, I mean, so what I found in my previous research is that there are ways of triggering like the production of social housing in a very short period of time with all these powerful policy and financial instruments. but the challenge is really how to place the well-being of the people in the center of these social housing policy models. So in the Chinese case, I would say like as long as the current model of like profit-driven urbanization continues, this type of social housing policy will likely to continue. In the Mexican case, because social housing is a kind of market product, and we have seen this clear trend that that market is shrinking in terms of the social housing for low-income working class because of the bad quality of the construction and also all these financial problems associated with that. So still for me, like it's important to call for a profound change in terms of the way that countries urbanize, right? It's a question of how to create a more inclusive and equitable urbanization model. That's a challenge for many countries, I would say. Yeah.
John, you work mostly in developing nations. Do you see housing becoming a bigger issue and a higher priority, more resources?
Thank you. I think housing has become everybody's day worry today because we all know that Corona has taught us that a house is the first point you want to seek refuge before you even look at anything. But in the developing world, they have very numerous competing things that they want to achieve, especially the governments. The other thing is that they don't even have policies around some of these housing deficit that we are looking at. In Liberia, for example, they even don't have much policies on housing that you can go and advocate and say, look, you said you wanted to do this. Why are you not doing it? So I think housing would continue to attract attention, especially with these infectious diseases coming up every single year or a couple of years. But we need to do more advocacy, and we need to let governments get to know that a house prioritized means health prioritized. A house prioritized means economic development prioritized. A house prioritized means you are putting future into the younger generation. And I think this is something we need to advocate.
Great, thank you. Helen Collins, we'll finish with you and the UK.
Okay, so three things. Let's be optimistic. The affordable housing policy priority, I think it's here to stay because affordability and quality is so stretched all over the globe now. And COVID brought that into sharp relief. As everyone else has already said, good quality housing equals better infection management. It's a middle class issue, that's number two, so that's not going to go away. Finally, the sustainability and ethical social governance credentials of investing in affordable housing are incredibly high. So investing for both the economic benefit and the societal benefit is a powerful combination. And when you throw in the need to spend to decarbonize that stock and the legacy stock, and the economic benefit of creating supply chains for decarbonisation, I think there's every reason to be optimistic that it should stay high on the political agenda.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks to all of our presenters. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure that the participants in the session today have learned a lot. So many thanks to you all for that. And I know there's a bunch of issues that we would like to follow up with you on. This session was recorded, and so we'll be posting it on our website, and we'll be posting your presentations as well. And we'll give the panel a virtual round of applause here for your great work. Thanks again, and thank you all attendees for spending 90 minutes with us, and we will enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.
You, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.